Thank you. Dr. Betts, welcome to our committee. Thank you for coming to present before us today. You have 20 minutes to deliver your presentation, followed by a 40-minute question period. When there's 5 minutes left in your time, the chair will indicate to you that you have 5 minutes left. So, Dr. Betts, over to you.
And thanks to all of you for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure not only to be presenting on some of my favorite topics, but also just to be in New Brunswick in general. I've been on sabbatical here for the last 10 months and really enjoying it. So yeah, thanks. I look forward to your questions. So today my overall presentation is on a science-based approach to understanding herbicides and forest management for biodiversity. I'll be pulling from some data that I've collected in Oregon over 10 years and some data that I've been working on just in New Brunswick, actually over the last 8 months during my sabbatical. So just a little bit about me. This is what I spend most of my time doing, thinking about wood supply globally and regionally, and how to balance that supply with how to conserve all the other species on the planet. Estimate of 8 million species on the planet, so it's no small challenge to try and do these things. And of course, we have billions of people worldwide that depend on wood for their livelihoods and their existences. So this has been the focus of my career, really, for the last 20 years. I know my tagline says Oregon State University, but I grew up here in New Brunswick, just outside of St. John. I paid for my university by tree planting out on Irving lands and in Ontario. And I just thought you'd appreciate this picture my mom dug up when she heard I was giving this presentation. So I think I planted 4,000 trees in a day, if you can believe it. That was my record. I had some lows as well. So today I'm going to talk about this long-term study we've been doing in Oregon on herbicides and wood production and biodiversity. Then I'm going to talk about forest ecology, just a little primer for those of you that aren't as familiar with New Brunswick's forests. And it'll be a review for the rest of you. And honestly, a little bit of a break from some of the data I'm going to show you in the first one, which might be detailed. And then finally, I'm going to tell you about this research I've been doing the last 10 months on forest management in New Brunswick over the last 35 years and how it's affected our plants and animals. And as part of that management strategy, herbicides have been an important part. So you're going to see the long-term effects of herbicides on animal populations. So yeah, herbicides, wood production, and biodiversity. So it won't be surprising to you that herbicide use is extraordinarily controversial in Oregon as well. It's been all over the newspapers, and these are issues in terms of human health and also in terms of biodiversity conservation. We have a very strong environmental community in Oregon, so there's been a lot of pressure on policymakers. So Triangle Lake is probably one of the most famous areas for this controversy. Lincoln County, which is in western Oregon on the coast, was the first county in the entire United States to ban aerial herbicide spraying. And I'm not talking about banning it just on public land. It was they had a ballot measure to ban it on private land, which was remarkable at the time. That was since overturned by a judge, and now is in front of the courts again. So really, I just want to emphasize herbicide looms large in Oregon. And then recent results showing that biodiversity may also be responding directly to the effects of herbicide. A particular study that shows that Roundup could be causing bee deaths. So that's the context for some of our research. And so over the last, well, it's 11 years now actually, we've been asking this question: how is biodiversity, and that's the variety of all life, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a second, affected by herbicide use in Oregon's forests? So we set up an experiment, and experiments are considered sort of the gold standard in science. Experiments are really the only way you can attribute cause to an action. This is not a correlative study. And the experiment involved planting clear cuts, which is the standard industrial practice in Oregon, followed by planting, and then completely variable levels of herbicide. And hopefully, can everyone see this okay? So on the top left, you have the control where no herbicide was sprayed. And if you can, remember this color scheme. Green is control. Blue is a light spray, and I'll show you what that means in a second. Just sprayed once, and that's similar to what happens on state lands in Oregon. That orangey yellow color is a moderate spray with 2 applications of herbicide, and that's more similar to what happens on industrial lands. And then finally, we had this treatment called intensive that really nobody does. We nicknamed it the Mordor Treatment, and that it was a total of 3 and 4 sprays of herbicide. And the reason we did that was to push the buttons to see if biodiversity responded, and also whether spraying that much herbicide actually increased tree growth rates. So I'm not going to go over this table in detail at all, but it's just to point out the herbicide schedule that should be in your printed materials, and to point out that this study was not designed to determine the effect of a particular active ingredient in herbicides. It was designed to test how the slurry of chemicals used by foresters in Oregon, and really in many industrial forests, affects biodiversity. And so you can see from control with no spray all through intensive, a variety of elements used. And glyphosate was included in the moderate and the intensive. They're quite commonly used operationally in Oregon. And so, of course, we didn't just have one of each of these treatments. It's good science to have many replicates. And you can see here that color scheme again. You can actually tell the treatments. This is a few years after spraying. You can tell the treatments from space that agree to which they're green, with a control not only surrounded in green, but also coming up green. And we replicated these, we call these study blocks, so all 4 treatments, 8 times across Western Oregon. And what that gives us is strong inference and ability to extrapolate beyond the specific little study boundaries. So prepare you for this. I'm going to give you all of our methods in the next 30 seconds. Okay, so I apologize for the whirlwind, but so we have these treatments, the 4 treatments. You're with me there, I think. And then we measured what we call the direct effects. You know, it's expected that herbicides are going to kill herbaceous plants and shrubs. So we went out and we measured the full diversity to the species level in all of these different plants. Then we had light traps for moths. 350 different species. We counted arthropods using sweep nets and pitfall traps. We went out and we put camera traps out for deer and elk, the 2 dominant ungulates in the region. We did pollination surveys, both with blue vein traps and at flowers. And we went out and we counted birds by ear at all of these sites. So it's one of the most extensive field campaigns that I've done in my life. Of course, I didn't collect the data. We had an army of field assistants, and they'd all be rolling their eyes and thinking that I'm describing this so quickly, but it's okay. So in total, we ended up with over 140,000 detections of all these different species, and in total, over 800 taxa. I say taxa because some of the insects weren't identifiable below genus. So now I'm going to show you some plots, and I'm afraid to say that the presentation didn't entirely come through perfectly in the translation, but it was a bit late. But I want you to, if you can, pay attention to this graph. This is just the abundance of woody plants across treatments, okay? And unfortunately, the light treatment is missing for some random reason. But you can see the green, which is the control, and the red, which is the intensive, and the orange, which is the industrial standard. Okay, so as you would expect, herbicides have seriously changed the abundance of woody plants in our system. Not surprising, but an important finding. With herbaceous plants, a similar effect, but less significantly so. Interestingly, for flowers, and again, I'm sorry, the 2 medium treatments aren't showing up. We actually see more flowers, just sheer abundance in the intensive, and I can tell you that's driven entirely by the fact that those flowers are non-native weedy species that moved into the growing space caused by the intensive herbicide spray. Okay, and the results overall are really similar for species richness as well, with big differences in richness for woody and herbaceous species. So again, this wouldn't really surprise anyone. You know, these herbicides are designed to kill these plants. So the question is, and these are the results I just showed you, do these effects propagate up through the food web? When you remove all those plants, do we see changes in pollinators and birds and ungulates? And the answer is that for birds, yes, we see quite strong effects, especially in the first year. For birds in later years, things tended to equalize in terms of abundance and richness. So 5 years out from spraying, the controls are looking a lot more like the treatments. Bees, we actually didn't find a significant difference for abundance, but we did for richness, with more richness in the controls. Arthropods, the same pattern, higher richness in the controls than the treatments, but no difference in abundance. Moss, no significant difference of either. And then finally, deer and elk. Actually, surprisingly, we had just as many detections in our camera traps across these. But I should emphasize that for the plants elk eat, they were depressed in abundance and deer. So overall, 18% fewer species across the 800 we observed. And mainly this was driven by plants, pollinators, which obviously have important ecosystem service effects, and birds. So the next bit, and this is the important bit in terms of balance, how do these intensive forest management practices, or herbicides, affect tree growth rates? Because we were told when we started this study we'd actually need special dispensation from Salem Capital to allow us to do the experiment, because they thought all of our plantations with no herbicide would fail. So put it in that context and look at this result. There's not that much difference between the green and the red. You see? It's about, and my eyesight is bad, getting old. It's around 20% higher growth rates. That's board feet, by the way, on the x-axis. So it's about 20% increase in growth rate as a result of spraying all of those herbicides. Okay, and these data are timber modeled out to rotation age. And in this case, the assumption is a 40-year rotation age. Okay, if we go to longer rotation ages, so we let trees grow longer, those differences get a bit more pronounced. So if you let trees grow 60 years and cut them, you're going to gain about 30% wood volume. Okay, here, I'm going to show you a picture in a bit. Trees grow a lot slower. And so I'd be fascinated to know. See the same graph for New Brunswick. Of course we need this to be put in the public domain before we can make really good decisions. The last thing I'm going to show you on this topic is economic revenue. And this is something that was new to me. You should know I'm not an economist. I've done economics in university, but I don't have a PhD in economics. So this was a collaboration with a colleague at Oregon State. What we did here was we calculated something called the land expectation value. And this involves something called discounting, which probably some of you are quite familiar with. Okay, but I'm going to walk you through it in clip art, because this is what I do for my students. So here we have the Honorable Ms. Johnson with some money to invest. And she's trying to decide whether she should go out and plant and spray, or whether she should plant and then take the money she would have spent on herbicide and invest it. Okay? Logical thing to try and decide between. And so if you invest that money, your trees don't need to grow quite as quickly to compensate for that discount rate. If you spray, your trees need to grow more quickly because you've got to pay that discounted $200 per hectare 40 years or 50 years or 60 years into the future when you cut those trees down. So the discount rate on that amount, $200 per hectare, turns out to be $2,057 at the 40-year rotation, right? So you're not spending $200, you're spending $2,000, and those trees better grow really quickly, or you're not going to compensate for that $2,000 spent. So the results, and keep in mind this is a fast-growing forest, at a 4% discount rate, sure enough, spraying herbicides pays. And by that I mean if you're only expecting a 4% yield in your investments. Okay, and that's far below what investors expect in Oregon, actually. At 7% discount rate, which is more like what people expect who invest in forestry in Oregon, there's really not that much of a difference. And so the herbicides pay to some extent when discounted, but less so. And then if you go all the way up to 10% discount rates, which I do wish, I'm sure all of us wish our investments would pay that well. Of course, herbicides don't pay at all, and you might as well have stayed home and saved your money on the herbicide. So again, this would be something, maybe somebody's already done this in New Brunswick, but I would love to see this full cost benefit analysis done. When you invest that $29 million in herbicides, does it actually pay at rotation age when discounted? Could the money be spent in a more efficient way somewhere else? And again, these are some trees planted in one of my study sites. This is one of my grad students, Hong Kyu Kim. And you can see these are 6-year-old trees. The leader on that tree in the foreground is about 1 meter long. Foresters call it a speed wobble. They grow so quickly, they end up with a bit of a spiral to them. All right, so conclusions: biodiversity often negatively impacted by herbicides, about 80% reduction in species richness. Tree growth rates do improve, but really not as much as expected. We did not need to get a special permit in those controls. And it remains to be seen. They might diverge from what our models predicted. They might do even better than we thought. And really, we need to determine the economics of herbicide. Okay, very quickly now. Switch gears, and this is going to be a photo essay. I was just down on the Fundy Coast in my old PhD study area last week and thought I'd take you some pictures to walk through some of these basic ideas. So I'm going to show you 2 pictures, and permission to ask questions of the members. Is that okay? So I'm going to ask you to determine and tell me what differences you see between these 2 stands. This one, ready? And the next one. Okay, I'm going to show them to you together. So what are the differences that leap out to you? Well, on the left, we've got a mature red spruce, yellow birch stand. On the right, we've got a spruce plantation near the Fundy Coast. It's okay to say obvious things, yeah.
On the left.
It's greener on the left, yeah, and that's because there's so much shade on the right that it's really not enabling herbaceous plants to grow very well. Anything else that's leaping out at you? Think from an animal's perspective if you can, too.
The fauna growth, the ground growth.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and one important thing to consider is the structure. We call it vertical structure in wildlife language. You've got lots of layers on the left, and really it's just sort of dead branches on the right. I didn't get a good picture, but the crowns are quite healthy. But there's not much layering, and layering means more species generally in ecology. Anything else? There are. There's much higher density, actually. Volume, we'd have to go out and measure, but numbers of stems, yes, and they've been planted. So someone like me went in there and planted them at 6-foot spacing. And some other ones, and I better move along here. Dead wood is a big one. 20% of biodiversity in a forest is tied up in dead wood. Who would have thought 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when we were saying dead wood was just a waste of space? 20% of the biodiversity is locked up there, and you can see the standing snag, second over from the left, a dead wood on the ground, and of course, higher diversity of trees themselves. So the other big difference between plantations in New Brunswick and most places really and naturally regenerated forest has to do with the tree age. So typically in Oregon and in New Brunswick, we don't let trees get much older than 60 years before we harvest them, if things are going well. Some of these native old forests, some of these species can live to be 250, 300 years old. And you can imagine how it's quite different from a wildlife perspective. The other thing I want you to notice in this particular picture is all the green stuff coming up below. What are those? There's moss there, but also red spruce. Okay, these spruce are growing really well, albeit in the shade. They're called shade tolerant, which means they can manage shade for a long time. When the canopy opens up, they're released and they grow. So if I went in there with a saw and cut down a patch opening or a few tree opening, you'd get natural regen. No need for herbicides at all. That's a really important message. So this is quite a standard practice in New Brunswick, although reduced to some extent. A clear cut where I planted all my trees through my tree planting career. It doesn't necessarily need to come back as plantation. A number of our clear cuts are naturally regenerated, and that's what you see here. These are shade intolerant species, and they crowd into the room as soon as you cut. They're very good at competing. And so it's species like red maple and sugar maple, or sorry, red spruce and sugar maple don't compete that well against these species like white birch and pin cherry and raspberry, of course. So there are 2 trajectories, and this intolerant hardwood trajectory, I'll call it, is what will happen naturally after a clear cut if it's not planted and sprayed. These tree species are often lower value. And it can take up to 150 years to get the original forest starting to regenerate underneath the canopy of these intolerant hardwoods, okay? So the take-home message then is the history in New Brunswick has been one of moving from the mature forest, either mixed or hardwood, toward plantations that tend to be more simple structurally and with only a few species in them, or moving toward intolerant hardwood, which are these species that compete really well and grow quickly. But it's certainly a conversion that we're talking about. Okay, last section. 5 minutes?
Actually,
Oh no.
yeah, I held my hand up, it was
Well,
5.
well, maybe someone will ask me a question about the next bit. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, at this point, unfortunately, I have to turn to the official opposition, and they'll ask you questions, and then we'll go around to each political party. So first up, official opposition.
I'll start.
Madame Landry.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Betts, for being with us this afternoon. Sorry. A few questions. Your studies or your research has mainly been done in Oregon forest, on Oregon forest. How do you compare that forest with the Acadian forest that we have in New Brunswick?
Yeah, there are a few very important, that's a good question. There are a few very important differences when it comes to management. One is the trees grow a lot more quickly. You know, if you're looking for volume, you want to grow trees somewhere like Oregon. If you're going for value, you want to grow trees somewhere like New Brunswick because our trees grow slower, but my goodness, they're beautiful wood. You know, so that's one major difference. Another difference is that we do have a huge suite of tree species that do grow really well in shade. Douglas fir, those pictures I was showing you in plantations, I have to admit, it does not grow well in the shade at all. So our foresters' argument for the need to make big openings in Oregon in order to grow wood are certainly have a lot of truth to them. Okay, here, red spruce is not going to grow as well. Sugar maple, yellow birch, ash, some of our favorite shade-tolerant trees do not grow as well. So that's a major difference. Another one is that most of the land that produces the wood in Oregon tends to be large private. Okay, so there's a lot less government intervention and a lot less public investment in those lands. It's not to say there isn't controversy over herbicide use on them, because those private lands are immediately adjacent to public lands, to schools, and to places where people fish. So those are three really big differences between the Oregon and New Brunswick.
Okay. The other question I have, and I would like after that to talk about your recommendations because you didn't have time to go there, but I was surprised to hear that there was no cost-benefit study done in New Brunswick, the economics of herbicide in New Brunswick. Can you elaborate, or where do you take that information? I have a hard time believing that since we've been talking about herbicide in New Brunswick, there's nothing that has been done on the economics of it.
And there could well be. Certainly nothing experimental like in our study. So that's what I would love to see happen in the short term. But I think it's something you could do even without a long-term experimental study to, discount the effects of herbicide over time in relation to tree growth rates and really work out whether that public investment is worth it. And I have not, as I said, I'm not an economist, so it could well be there are publications out there. But please do. I strongly encourage you to find them if they exist. Because it's a critical part of the equation, isn't it? And if we're seeing biodiversity declines because we're spraying, and then it turns out the spraying isn't really helping in terms of the bottom line, that would be a big mistake, wouldn't it? So.
Okay, so that would be a good thing to find out what has been done on that. On that, on one of the last pages in your document, your initial recommendations. Would you like to talk about that a little bit for us?
Oh, sure. No, I'd love to do that.
Yeah.
And the biggest one to do with herbicide really is to do that economic discounting analysis.
Okay.
The other one, as far as I know, and I am more expert on this, there have been very few controlled, replicated, randomized studies done on how biodiversity, wildlife respond to herbicides. And there's good reason for this. They're hard. You know, it cost about $1.5 million from various agencies to be able to do what I just presented to you. And it took 10 years. You know, but nevertheless, I strongly recommend it's worth doing in New Brunswick. We have some brilliant scientists here who work for DNR, who work for UNB, U2M, and the companies as well. So there's really no reason why we shouldn't have it here at a fraction of the cost of the silviculture budget. You know, so those are my two major herbicide-related recommendations.
And in regard to habitat and biodiversity, you had 2 recommendations as well?
Yeah, so, and I think those still make sense even though I didn't get to the last part of my presentation. You know, one is, because we can regenerate trees so well underneath canopy, it argues toward doing more of that sort of silviculture. And we don't need herbicide to do that. You know, so, and the other bit, so that's one. And the other one is we're getting so low on tolerant types of forest, mature, tolerant hardwoods and tolerant mixed woods, that I'm getting worried, honestly, that the future of species that depend on those forest types is uncertain. And that was the topic of my next bit of the presentation. But the footprint of cutting and spraying in New Brunswick is quite substantial, and Nova Scotia and PEI. We did all 3 provinces. And there's a concern that the declines in some of the species dependent on it are so severe that we should be doing more to try and protect it.
And what type of species would you see that has been declining?
Yeah, so thank you for asking these questions, by the way. So the only species that we really have good long-term data on are birds. Actually, that's not true. Trees and birds, and we're quite good at deer and moose. But this study was focused on birds because we've had volunteers surveying them for 60 years.
Okay.
So we can track their changes over time in relation to changes in the forest. And we measured changes in the forest using satellite imagery going all the way back to 1985. And so we can tie those declines to forest changes.
Okay. Thank you. I don't know if my colleagues have questions.
I feel that.
Just to clarify, you talked about the cost with the spraying, the increasing growth. Was it 20% you said that was noticed?
If I'm just a little bit difficult to hear you, but if you asked whether spraying increased growth rates by 20% at a 40-year rotation, that's right.
Okay.
And that's in relation, remember, to our Mordor treatment. The industrial standard was something like 18%.
Okay. And in that growth rate, was that based on the speed of growth or the actual intensity? Like, is it essentially were the trees growing faster or denser?
They're planted all at the same density, and
Okay.
so it's individual tree growth rates. But those results they use a forest modeling program to model forest total volume over the full rotation period, over that 40 years. So it's a volume that's most relevant when it comes to economic gain or what a forester would be hoping to have happen in a managed stand.
Because 20% is significant, I'd say, for foresters. It's 1/5, right?
Yeah, it's a non-trivial difference, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's all I had, Sean. If you want to take over.
I'll have a few questions. I got a couple minutes. First of all, I want to thank you very much, Mr. Betts, for being here. This is very solid information, and you talked about a better forest management program and biodiversity in New Brunswick, and so in all essence, there's a lot of information that you've been giving us, and is some of this information being given to the Department of Natural Resources? Is this something that your studies are being documented and being, they know about this information?
Yes, they certainly do. The first 2, the bits I presented are now published in the peer-reviewed literature from just actually months ago, and they have access to those and know about them. The last study here is in review, and they've seen it very briefly, but it's not yet formally out. So I presented it to them, but certainly they haven't had very long to respond. I mean, actually hadn't conducted this third study until really, I started it in December. It's been
Okay.
the focus of my sabbatical, so.
Okay, well, that's good.
Yeah, they've been very receptive and very supportive, actually, in terms of providing data and cooperating.
So, and I know that my colleague, you know, she asked you questions on the section we weren't able to cover, and I wish we could have covered it. But before I would like you, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes after my question is, can you give us in a breakdown what would be the biggest issues on the section you didn't cover?
Sure. Yeah, I think the biggest issues really have to do with the fact that herbicides, although I know I've been listening to the hearings for the last day, obviously they're of toxicological concern. But I was trying to point to the broader issue, which really has to do with the forest management regime we use, of which herbicides are a part. And I wanted to point out that there are alternative ways. I think that regime is resulting in these wildlife population declines, not as a direct toxic effect of herbicide, or highly unlikely, more just because of habitat loss. You know, we're changing our forests. If you've driven around New Brunswick, you're probably quite aware that it looks different now than it did 30 years ago. And the question is, how much of that change is too much? You know, and this is what people at DNR have been working on for 20 years. And so, as far as I know, this third study is the first time anyone's documented population changes due to that management. Previously, it was, oh, we sort of know we're doing it, but you know, is it an issue? And this shows that it is an issue. We looked at 54 different bird species, and over the last 10 years, 90% of them have experienced habitat declines. And that's not Matt Bett's going out and picking 54 species he thinks are sensitive. That's actually just the 54 most common species in New Brunswick forests. You know, some of them are early successional, some of them are associated with old forest. And across that huge suite, you've got 90% losing habitat over the last 10 years, which to me, I was surprised in some ways. What I would have thought would have happened is something we call ecological replacement, right? You lose a starling, you gain a cardinal. You know, once habitat bad for one species, but oh, you look, you know, another species comes in and fills that niche, great. But that, for some reason, that's not happening, and I think that reason is, you saw that picture of that multi-layered old forest that can pack a lot of species into it, compared to a more simplified plantation that cannot. It only has 2 or 3 or 4 species in it. So I think that's what's going on. And so that's the main take-home. Sorry that was a bit wordy, but these are important points to get across.
That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you for that. Next up, we have Mr. Kuhn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question really is, can you tell us what you were going to tell us about forest management and biodiversity in New Brunswick? And you're welcome to use my 10 minutes.
Thanks, David. So, is this okay with everybody? I think it is. 10 minutes? Okay. So, I've already described some of this, so it's going to be even easier. These are data from our remote sensing analysis that show the cumulative amount of clear cutting over time in the Maritime provinces as a whole. And then the purple line is the amount of area that's been planted and or pre-commercially thinned. So managed in such a way that it's simplifying the structure of the forest. And then on the right here, we have the map that we derived that shows that clear-cut disturbance and associated plantation. I apologize, on this particular slide, the purple is very close to the pink, so you can't distinguish them. But the take-home message is that a high proportion of the places we clear-cut are planted. And then remember, if we don't plant them, they tend toward intolerant hardwoods, which are certainly a different sort of forest and likely lower quality habitat for many of these species. So, and this is an extreme view of the conversion that's happened over the last 35 years. You can at least picture how this forest was similar on both sides of the road and now has moved from mixed wood forest to conifer forest. So I did want to justify the interest in birds, and I've already done that briefly, but birds are seen broadly as biodiversity indicators, and there are a number of reasons for that. You know, it goes all the way back to people having canaries in coal mines back at the turn of the century in New Brunswick. And of course, we all know that our understanding of DDT first emerged, at least partly because people started noticing eggshell thinning in birds, and that led to the cessation of DDT in many parts of the world. Birds also have been some of the harbingers of climate change. And so this is a paper by a friend of mine in Nature from the late 90s, and they were the first species really to be shown to extending their range northwards as the climate warmed in the UK. And then I think you've already talked about this, but birds are also insect consumers. And this is a bay-breasted warbler, a photo I took just a couple weeks ago, actually, down near the Fundy Coast. And it's well known to be a budworm specialist. And so the ecosystem services, we call them, provided by birds can be very important. And then finally, and I mentioned this already, we sample them very well. This is a map of the Maritimes, obviously. All the black dots you can see are the Maritimes breeding bird atlas. Okay, and the breeding bird atlas is a volunteer, mostly volunteer atlas where people span the province counting birds at all those points over a 4-year period. Remarkable effort. And then the orange routes are a separate survey, but they go all the way back to 1960. And people go out every June and drive along those 50-kilometer long roads, and they count birds on either side of them. So it's an amazing data set. We've got nothing similar for lichens. We've got nothing similar for flying squirrels, marten. Deer comes close, right? So that's the reason to focus on birds. And so I want you to think of them as indicators, but also it's the only taxon we can really study well. And so the question that I've been working on these last 8 months are, how are bird populations affected by intensification of management in New Brunswick? So that pink image I showed you of the map with that substantial footprint, how is that affecting bird populations? And just really briefly, a little bit of technical stuff here. It's fun, so stick with me. We have 7 remote sensing bands that we get from Landsat. And the neat thing about Landsat, it's a satellite that's 750 kilometers above the Earth. It takes photos every couple months. And those go all the way back to 1985. So what we did was we built statistical models that matched bird locations to those remote sensing bands. And the models performed really well. And so it enabled us to backcast all the way to 1985 and then quantify how habitats changed. And so this is my good news graph is this one. Forest amount in New Brunswick has not changed much. And if this was Oregon, people would be pretty thrilled, you know, but we're urbanizing and people are sprawling out all over the place. In New Brunswick, not much area has been lost in forest. So that's a real win. Now I'm going to show you how bird habitats changed. This is a Blackburnian warbler. It's kind of the quintessential old forest species in New Brunswick, and probably none of you have seen it. Well, how many have seen it? Can I see a show of hands? Yeah, doesn't surprise me. It nests 30 meters up in red spruce, and really not many people know much about it, but it's not uncommon at all. And so what I'm going to show you here, hopefully if it works, is a video. Blue is habitat, and yellow is non-habitat. Can I show it to you again? No, I can't. But this gives you the bookends. 1985, blue is habitat, yellow is non, and 2020. And so what you should notice from this figure, if you've got good eyes, unlike me, is that the protected areas we established quite intelligently are now standing out in 2020 as the remaining Blackburnian habitat. And then there are some swaths still left. That's some good news. I do want to emphasize that you don't need strict protection either to maintain a species or to maintain the mixed forest it depends on. You know, you could do intelligent silviculture that doesn't require herbicides. So we did this for all 54 species. This is another one, golden crowned kinglet, and you can see the change from blue to blue in 1985 to 2020. And this is sort of the take-home message figure. The species are all listed. I don't expect you to read them from top to bottom in order of how much habitat they've lost over time. And you can see that the majority of species have gone from yellow to red or green to red, which means habitat loss. And again, this is not a selected or biased suite of species. This is just a naive top 54 species of birds that rely on forests in New Brunswick. And so this is the sort of pattern we're seeing for habitat. This is for the 7 most declining species. So about a 33 to 40% decline in habitat for these species since 1985. So the question you'd be asking if you've got a science bent is, all right, we modeled habitat change, but who's to say that means bird population change? It could well be these birds are packing in or going elsewhere. And so we also modeled how populations have changed over time. And these are the 8 worst. You know, I'm giving you the bad news. But for some of these species, we're seeing declines of up to 80% over time. And not all of that is driven by these changes in forest structure, but a high proportion of it is for some of these species. All right, so we also, because we know the territory sides of all these birds and we know how much habitat has been lost, we can estimate how many individual birds have likely been lost over the period of time from 85 to 2020. So again, we think these declines, and we have evidence that it's happening as a function of conversion from mature, mixed, and hardwood and softwood forests to plantations and intolerant hardwood. And I guess the question I'd throw out to you is, you know, if this is happening for birds, and, you know, honestly, they can move around pretty well. They are more generalist than a number of other species. And so we just don't know what's happening to more specialized species like flying squirrel or American martin and others. This map is of how much mixed wood forest has changed over time. I apologize to those of you who are red-green colorblind. I should have thought of that. But the red is mixed wood forest that's been lost. The green is mixed wood forest that's being maintained. And again, the reserve network's working well, and some landowners are working well. And the blue is gain. You know, so we are gaining some of this mixed wood, but it's certainly not, the blue does not balance the red. All right, so the conclusions are intensive forest management's increasing plantation and clear-cut area, and that's not regenerating at the same rate as it's being harvested. This is driving habitat loss for 54 most common bird species, and then habitat losses associated with population declines. So, you know, the concluding questions then are, what should be the future of New Brunswick forests? You know, do we need to trade biodiversity for wooden jobs? And I'm optimistic. I don't think that we do. I think we can continue to produce wood. It just takes intelligent silviculture and intelligent planning. And we can slow or stop the bird declines and the habitat loss. So I've given you my recommendations, so I won't spend more time on that. I'd be really happy to hear more questions, but thank you all for being good enough to listen to that last 10 minutes. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Kuhn. Next up, we have Ms. Conroy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Matt, for that very nicely done presentation. It gives you a real look of what's happening in the province, and some of it's kind of scary, and see, you know, the changes in the past, and you know, especially with the diversity. I see that a lot. We spend a lot of time in the woods, and from the diversity of the colors and stuff that you, even from the drive from home to here, where we see a lot more green. There's one part of the highway that is just literally separated, that you can see it. So it's really neat to be able to put it in, and to see it and put it in perspective. So I thank you for that as well. New Brunswick uses far more glyphosate-based herbicides than most other provinces and the states in North America. What's causing, do you think, our huge reliance on glyphosate in New Brunswick?
Well, that's a good question, and you know, obviously I haven't looked at that myself in my own research, but I can only speculate. My expectation is, and again, the study on comparative wood growth of conifers should be done, like the one we did in Oregon, but my expectation is that there's at least a belief that Those competing hardwood species I showed you that flood into the room after a clear cut are reducing the growth rates of conifers, which tend to be more valuable economically. So that economic bit to determine whether there are alternative methods that could be used, whether you could do completely different silviculture that doesn't open up that huge canopy, so you get that flood of early successional species in. Those would be the bits that I would focus on. But I do expect that's the main reason is that quite likely competition could be high with those early successional hardwood species. It makes life difficult if you're a conifer. Although I don't know if you've seen Suzanne Chouinard's book or broadcasts over the last few weeks, but she has some very interesting research that would be fascinating to do in New Brunswick, showing that there are actually collaborative relationships between some of these hardwoods and some of the conifers over the long term. So for example, species like alder actually fix nitrogen that is uptaken by the conifer species and helps them grow.
Given that 23% of the forest will be designated conservation areas, how wise do you think it is to intensely manage the 25% of the forest with plantations and spraying glyphosate so that the remaining 50 can be left to regenerate naturally?
That's a million, if not more, dollar question. It really is. Can you pay for conserving more area by growing wood more intensively in a small area? And I haven't done research on that here, but I have to admit that it's a tempting idea. But we need to know more about how to do silviculture well that might negate the need for those herbicides, just out of carefulness or cautiousness. And perhaps there are ways of growing trees at a similar pace without them. And also, perhaps the focus should not be on volume, but more on quality, as I said. It was such an eye-opener to me to go to Oregon and see the rates of tree growth there. And then still to hear people complaining that they weren't growing fast enough and they were at a competitive disadvantage. I pointed out that the trees I planted when I was a kid grew about this fast every year. So I'm not sure that the focus should necessarily be on volume so much as quality. But still, it's, in terms of producing wood for humans on Earth, it's a really important question on whether we should have strict protection and pay for that protection with intensive management, with or without glyphosate, or whether we should be doing more ecological forestry, which reduces the volume, but could mean a bigger footprint. So the jury's out still on which of those approaches is best, and actually it could vary depending on where you are on Earth. Could be quite different in Oregon, for example, to New Brunswick.
Thank you for that. The forest industry has become very involved in wildlife research in New Brunswick in recent years. As a researcher yourself, have you experienced or know any examples where results are affected by such involvement?
Oh, you mean is industry research biased in some way? I haven't been here for 15 years, and I would actually be quite surprised if that were true. But I haven't lived here, so it's difficult to say.
Long enough to say, okay. With jurisdictions surrounding New Brunswick, like Maine, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, they're harvesting more deer in the last 30 years, and New Brunswick is harvesting, I think it was 80% less. What would you suggest that the discrepancy between these areas, would they be due to wildlife, coyotes, winter habitat?
I think that is more of a question for your local deer population biologist, if you can hold on to it for then.
I will.
Yeah, and the problem with ecology is there are so many interacting. I should have chosen physics, because there are so many interacting factors that drive population dynamics. Even among some of the well-known species, we have difficulty. But please do keep thinking about that question and ask somebody who's a local or regional ungulate biologist.
I will do that, thank you. What would your professional advice be to help New Brunswick manage its forest in the best interest of wildlife and the public?
Well, that's a good question. I think, as I said, the primary thing that I would do would be to find those remaining bits of mature forest that are still shade-tolerant species and manage them appropriately. They don't need to be in reserve. Some of them should be. We need to have more than 4%. And we will. I think we're moving in that direction. But the remaining ones we should be doing smart silviculture in. And I can say as a former forestry student, it's way more fun doing that kind of silviculture. There's so much more creativity involved with going out into a stand and trying to figure out which trees to cut and which ones to leave, how you're going to regenerate without herbicides. And so the way we maintain those are a combination of reserves and smart silviculture. I think we should stop clear cutting in those areas, honestly. And then if you're going to clear cut, focus on the areas we've already clear cut. You know, they've already been transformed to plantations or intolerant hardwood. There might be an interest in doing restoration forestry in some of them, but, you know, flippantly, I can say, why not? That's where we get our wood from. You know, those places we've already started doing intensive management.
And we seem to see that more, and people all over have noticed that and have commented about the amount of clear cutting now. It seems to be more and more of chop downs and more noticeable clear cuts.
Can I just answer that briefly? Yeah, and that I think will always be an issue, even if it's a plantation being clear cut. You know, people really don't like to see clear cuts. And that could be a challenge policy-wise. You know, if you were to continue to grow wood in those places that are plantations, probably the best way of regenerating them could well be, you know, that sort of treatment. But what I'm saying that's critical is those places that have not yet been harvested recently using the clear cut method with plantation, those really should be carefully looked after.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's all my questions. Thank you very much for everything, and thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Conroy. And next we'll have Minister Holland.
Dr. Betts, we all should just defer our 10 minutes and let you continue to talk, I think. This has been fascinating. This is one of the best presentations that I've seen in a long time. I would like to offer an invitation to you to come to the Department of Natural Resources and continue to flesh this out. I really have found incredible value. I hope my colleagues would all share that. Thank you for what we've seen.
Thank you.
Data, I always say information's ammunition, and there's all kinds of it here. I have way too many questions for 10 minutes, but I'm going to try to fit in as many as I can. So we're in a situation where here we are in 2021. We can't stand up trees that have already been cut. Are there ratios that you feel like if we got on Crown land, particular public land, we've got 3 million hectares. Is there a ratio that you would suggest as to how to best protect biodiversity from intensely managed forest to natural or protected areas?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and I spent the last 10 or 15 years looking for, I think by ratio, can I interpret that as threshold?
Sure, yeah.
We're all looking for thresholds, and the benefit of thresholds for those of the rest of you, these are amounts of habitat below which you don't want to fall because you'll see precipitous declines of whatever value you're interested in really, but in this case, biodiversity. And so let's talk, because we do have some evidence for thresholds that differ across species, and we can map them. So we can actually go to those parts of the province that are comfortably above a threshold and say, these are the spots we might want to conserve. And the ones that are already well below it, those ones might be more of a focus for more standard forest practices. Okay. So it's totally doable. There isn't the time to go into detail now, but.
Yeah, we're going to hit at 30,000 feet on a lot of subjects here, but where we have plantation footprints now, I mean, when you look at the map, there was a variety of different cutting, but right now we have a certain footprint of our Crown land that's in a plantation. Were you indicating that if you have X amount of area that's in plantation, that is the best area to focus on continuing plantation development and forestry and allowing the other areas to move into more ecological sustainability or biodiversity? If you can contain it, that you can have both live in the same world, is that?
Yes, yeah, that's what, and of course the recommendation, I'm going to do the scientist thing, right, and say it
Yeah.
depends, but of course the recommendation is contingent on a few important things. One is, will those plantations continue to be productive over multiple rotations?
It's like any crop,
Right.
yeah.
There's some evidence in, Scandinavia that there might be a fall down, but if you could continue long-term research on that forest productivity, and actually I think your department's already doing that, that's what I would choose to do, rather than rotate through natural forest and turn it to plantations, certainly. So,
The habitat loss there, if I go back to one of the slides that shows over the course of a period of time, I'm rushing because I don't want to lose time
no,
here.
that's fine. I can try and
Right
find
here. New Brunswick predicted habitat amount changes across 54 forest-associated species. 66% of species show net habitat loss since '85, 94% since 2010. Is that the sum total of the result of all the cutting we've done since, say, the 60s? And so we've seen that swing in the direction of habitat loss. And if we create protection, it's gonna allow that pendulum to come swing back. Like if we reinvest in mature protection, mature forest protection, or particular biodiverse conserved and protected areas, will we see a change in that by doing that?
I think so, yes. I mean, some of that might require some restoration.
Sure.
But no, if you look at this plot, though, and you stopped harvesting mature mixed forest, for example.
Yeah.
That red would immediately turn to a lighter color
Yeah.
and toward green. And if you did restoration, it would certainly go toward green. So, yeah. These results are not since the 60s, though. This really is just,
80s? Or
yeah, based on satellite imagery reflectance change since 1985.
85, yeah.
So there's no lag effect going on here.
So forestry is an industry here in New Brunswick, but you're saying a focus needs to be on protected areas, and that it'll be exempt from forestry?
No, actually, I would say that, I mean, a combination of more protection than we have, it's low. Your department's working on
Okay.
increasing that amount.
Yeah.
And then doing silviculture that matches the forest type on the remaining mature forest.
Okay, on the remaining mature forest,
Yeah.
okay.
So by all
we're not
means-
talking, you're not talking about plantation forest. That is what it is. It's a tree farm. But you're talking about silviculture practices on the forest floor outside of the plantation footprint?
That's the most critical part. It is. Yeah.
So selection and very, very careful forestry, avoiding that clear cutting in that mature forestry area. I mean, except of course when it gets to be old and it's starting to fall down, I guess that's a different story. But
And the smart silviculture will change by forest type. Right?
yeah,
It's
well,
very
not
good.
one size fits all.
Like, you wouldn't have someone go into a pure balsam fir stand and try a bunch of selection harvesting.
No.
But in a red spruce dominated yellow birch, absolutely it's going to respond well to that treatment. And sugar maple, and we already are. I have to say we've stopped completely converting tolerant hardwood forests into conifers now. That doesn't happen very much.
That's right.
But the focus should still be on doing smart individual tree selection in that type and avoiding those big open areas. Yeah.
I think I got two more questions I'm going to try to fit in here. When we go to the discount rates and you looking at the investment in a herbicide program versus an investment in putting the money in the bank, is there any factor in there that would have the increased offset cost of manual thinning? And I think there's a per hectare increase in the cost of your forestry management. And is that factored in to that number?
You would want to see, we didn't have a manual control treatment, but but in doing that economic analysis with a new study, absolutely, you'd want to discount that initial investment.
Okay.
Right? And so that's a critical thing to think about.
And I guess considering that the conversations here are around pesticides, herbicides, and its use, and we're talking about forestry, in your opinion, are you able to blend both forestry, whether it be moderate, light, intensive, conservation, if you've got to focus on all those groups, is herbicide a tool that can be used, should never be used, or used in concert with conservation efforts? What would your opinions be on the use of herbicide as it relates to the ability? I'm not talking about health, I'm talking about the ability to maintain a diverse forest mix.
Yeah, that's, I think probably just over the one day you've had, you realize the scientific uncertainty around the direct effects of herbicide is very high. So, in many ways, my opinions are relevant.
Sure.
What I would want to know would be, can we get more science on those direct effects of herbicide?
I think that's one of the things you
Yeah,
recommend, eh?
And if there's, and that I did watch Canadian Forest Service present, and I empathize with them because it's something very difficult to know about as well, isn't it? I mean, how do you possibly do a controlled study on long-term cumulative effects of a toxin?
Yeah.
Very difficult. So if I were premier, I have to admit, I'd have you're weighing multiple issues against each other. The risk to human health, the direct risk to wildlife of herbicide, but then it does enable you to concentrate use potentially and grow trees more quickly.
Yeah.
So it's one of these wicked problems. I would love to say stop spraying entirely, but if that meant that we had to go and harvest more areas that were already mature and mixed forest, it would really hurt, I think, the biodiversity of the province. So,
well, that leads into, if herbicide treatments allow for a growth of 20% of the volume over 40 years, if that was stopped, would that mean that there's a correlation between the size of the forestry footprint that would increase by over 20% in order to offset the volume that you're losing from the herbicide?
that would be a problem. Then, of course, the middle road is we stop thinking about volume and we start thinking about quality and accept that volume will be down. But I have to admit, that's a longer-term transition that your government would have to consider. And it's not something you could do tomorrow, but it's certainly something we should be striving toward as a province.
Well,
I mean, you've probably been to Georgia and British Columbia.
Yeah.
You see how these trees grow.
Yeah.
It's competing with that is always amazing.
It is. And the tough spot would be to stop a tap and then see the footprint of forestry so significantly increase in the province in order to meet the wood volumes.
It would have to be a phased in.
Yeah. Let's keep going.
All right, thank you, Minister Holland, and thank you, Dr. Betts. We really appreciate you being here today, and I know all of the members here today got a very informative presentation from yourself, and probably one we're going to spend some time thinking about and still researching when you leave. I'll give you a minute or two to say some parting words, and then we're probably going to take a 5 to 10 minute recess before we get the next group in, but go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I would just like to thank you all again for listening. And there's nothing that makes a scientist more happy than seeing their results, A, somebody interested in them, and B, somebody actually using them for some sort of policy. So I appreciate the fact that you spent so long listening to me. And what a lucky chance that I happened to be back in New Brunswick when this was happening. So thanks again. Yeah.